gears a little bit. As I mentioned at the outset of the morning, our group has divided itself into 4 subgroups to tackle specific issues that I won't reiterate now, other than to say that the first of those is one that's very fundamental because it does impact the options that one would consider in the other 3 areas. And that first group has to do with the shuttle usage and the space station usage and related issues. We had asked Sally Ride to chair that subcommittee, which she has done. And during the next few days, we'll be hearing a report from each committee. Sally's committee will be reporting now. As I said, a few of us have heard parts of this. The ones on the committee have heard it all. But this will be our first time to really be exposed thoroughly too. So, Sally, the floor is yours.
Thank you, I think, and you've got our presentation. I will say, though, that it's a relief to be on this side, not looking. Should all be very envious of me up here. We are the ISS-STS subcommittee. It's myself, Leroy, Charlie, and Les, and you'll be hearing from all of us today. The master questions that we were asked to address are, how long is the gap and can it be shortened? What is a prudent shuttle flyout plan? And are there any extension scenarios that could bring significant benefit that are worth looking at? And finally, should ISS be extended? And if so, at what capability should it be extended? So our group is the one that's dealing most directly with the current elements of the infrastructure, the shuttle and the ISS, and the relatively near-term issues that come with those, including, not the least of which is the budget constraints that we're going to be working under. As you know, the full committee mandate is to come up with at least 2 options that fit under the budget profile we were given. And one of the things you'll be seeing today is that is not an easy task. I think we have come to believe very firmly, and Norm, we took this principle from you, that it's important to have a realistic view of what the existing program, as it will realistically unfold, most likely will cost, and not put any smoke and mirrors to the budget to make it look like it fits under the budget profile. So we've been doing a fair amount of work trying to get at what we think is a realistic unfolding of the current near-term parts of the program and costing those. So in some sense, we have what is either an advantage or a disadvantage over the other sub-teams, we're definitely more constrained by reality. Which you could take as either a good thing or a bad thing. We're actually just hoping that we escape from this day without being nicknamed the Doom and Gloom Subcommittee. We actually have been considering whether we should have a subgroup logo, and if so, it should definitely be the Gordian knot. So with that, can we go on to the next slide? I'll just give you the quick schedule of what we're thinking about today. I'll give the background, particularly on the current program, just very, very quickly, and some context, particularly the budgetary context, and describe the 3 shuttle scenarios that we've come up with. Then Les will give us the benefit of some of the things that he's been hearing both in our subcommittee and his international subcommittee on the international considerations, which leads very naturally into a discussion of the space station scenarios, which Leroy will lead. And then Charlie will be our summarizer and facilitator in what we hope will be a discussion among the whole committee, because we would really like to come out of, if not today, this week, after we've heard from all the different subcommittees, on some consensus on what work you would like us to be doing in the next couple of weeks, but maybe more importantly, which of our pieces you think mesh with scenarios that the other groups are doing, so that we can start doing a good integrated budgetary look at some combined scenarios. What you're going to be seeing today just came out of our group. Next one. Very, very quickly, the current program, the Shuttle, there are 7 flights remaining. Last flight is scheduled for September 2010. That's the very end of the fiscal year 2010. The retirement is intended to free some amount of money for Constellation, and we'll talk about that more in a second. ISS is to be completed next year. Current budget plan is to deorbit ISS in early 2016. And that deorbiting of ISS frees, again, some money for the Constellation program. Constellation, as we just heard, it should be IOC in March of 2015, with the Orion initially going to ISS. Next one. Okay, this is the program, and we wanted to give you just very quickly lay out the baseline budget that our full committee has been working with from now through 2020 or 2010 till through FY 2020, and show you what the different elements take up of that. This is the space station, the space shuttle's contribution to that budget, and you see shuttle retirement in the very end of FY 10, with some transition costs going into 11, retirement and transition costs. Next. Here's Constellation coming in. Constellation takes over some of the money that is freed up by shuttle retirement. Next one. That shows you the gap that we've been talking about that in this plan goes from end of FY10 to mid FY15. Next one. Here's ISS. ISS under this budget goes through FY15 and is deorbited very early in 2016, and you see the arrow to ISS retirement. Now, we go on to the next slide because we wanted to use this to illustrate, this one's important because that black line shows what our entire committee has been given as the available budget for this exercise. And 2 of our options are supposed to come in within that black line. All right, next one. One of the issues that we've gotten into some, and I think it's important as we do budgeting of our full scenarios to get a very clear handle on, and we're working closely with I'm working with Bo and have worked with Ed to try to get an understanding of this across the groups. We've still got a ways to go, but this is illustrative. We've asked NASA's PA&E group, the independent group, to give us a cost of the shuttle program, fiscal 10, broken down into the carrying costs, that is the costs that the shuttle is currently now bookkeeping, that will be transferred to some other program, presumably Constellation, but not necessarily all Constellation, but someplace else in NASA the day the shuttle retires, or the moment the shuttle retires. The middle bar is the additional shuttle costs associated with the solid rockets and ATK, and the far right bar is in some sense, the real cost savings, if you want to look at it that way, of retiring the space shuttle, the real cost savings to NASA as a whole that can be used for actually programmatic development. Now, there's work to be done in getting at the specific elements within those bars, but I just wanted to make the point that it's very easy to fool yourself and think that by retiring the shuttle, or in fact retiring the station, you're gaining all this money that can be used in any way that you might so choose. And that's not entirely correct, and it's important that we have an appreciation for that as we go on. Next slide. All right. Now, again, we wanted to try to get a sense of how we thought the current program would most likely unfold, to try to get a sense at if we were to lay out a baseline budget along with a more realistic program, what would that baseline budget look like? A more realistic unfolding of this program. So the first thing that we looked at on that, we looked at both the shuttle, the Constellation, and the space station in the 2010 to 2020 timeframe and just said, okay, what do we think is perhaps more realistic? Well, we think the shuttle flyout is likely to extend into FY11. The shuttle program would not disagree with that. There's little margin remaining in the current manifest. The administration, in fact, has directed NASA to fly out at a safe rate and not worry about making it by September 30th, FY10. So they appreciate the importance of a prudent manifest. But, of course, there's currently no funding reflected in the FY11 budget for that possible fly out into 2011, and so that's setting you up right away for a budget problem in 11. To estimate what a reasonable flyout scenario might be, just for budgetary purposes, for planning, we compared the real post-Columbia flight rate to the currently projected flight rate. And there are some anomalies in the post-Columbia flight rate, so we don't say that this is the number that should be taken. But post-Columbia, the average number of days between flights was 115 days. The currently projected manifest number of days between flights on average is about 62 days. And those numbers are, plus or minus a day. They were done actually before the most current launch, the flight that's up there now. We said 115 days is a little bit long. The more recent experience is actually closer to 90 days. Let's assume an average of 90 days. What does that do for your flyout of the existing manifest? And it implies a flyout to March of 2011. So that is what we've taken for prudent budget planning, and we think that would be a wise number to just put into a planning budget. Next slide. All right. Now, what about Constellation? The Bose LEO Access team and my sub-team asked Aerospace to perform an independent assessment of the Constellation program. We didn't think it was fair to ask NASA to try to conduct an independent assessment of itself and its own program. We asked Aerospace to take a look at the cost of the program, schedule, technical challenges, and risk. They did this very quickly. This was just about a three-week endeavor, but they have quite a bit of experience at this. And this is something that they are used to being asked to do for a variety of other programs of comparable complexity. And the results of that program indicate what have been indications from other sources that Constellation is likely to slip. Next slide. Now let me give you a good perspective on why Constellation is likely to slip. And it's, I think a lot of it is tied to the budget that Constellation thought it was going to get when the vision was established, compared to the budget that Constellation is currently looking at. And it's a huge change. The top blue line is the anticipated funding at the time of ESAS, about the time of the vision. So that's the number that Constellation thought it was going to get out through 2020, I think. Then the red line is actually the FY09 budget. So this was the last year's budget. So this is what it's been living under for a while now. The orange line is the more recent FY10 budget. And you can see that it's yet another reduction. And then if you assume that ISS is extended, there's an additional chunk of money that needs to come from somewhere. And we asked Aerospace to take a look at if it came from the Constellation program, because Constellation was supposed to get that extra ISS money. What would that do to the program? So Aerospace folded this budgetary information in, took a look at the technical risks and costs, and came out with a projection. Next one. Overall, their results, a lot of error bars on this, but they felt that there was a potential 1.5-year impact to IOC based solely on the budget. that the effects of the FY10 budget reduction would stretch the program out a year and a half beyond current IOC. They tried to separate out, to the extent that it's possible, the effects of technical cost and schedule risk, and estimated that there's about a 2-year impact due to the technical risk, schedule risk. And then taking a look at how ISS extension would affect that, they estimated about another half year on the IOC. So next chart. If you look at this graphically, this is what they came up with, and you're all going to be hearing more about this in some more detail from Bo's group tomorrow. But we wanted to give the overview here to start getting at the motivation for our budget planning. You can see the bar at the bottom shows these effects concatenated. You see the FY10 budget effects in the dark red, then the yellow is the technical cost risks, and the ISS extension risks. When you add all those together, it's a big number. We decided that was more conservative than we needed to be, but that just looking at this and applying our best judgment, we said it would be wise to assume a 2-year slip to the Constellation IOC just for prudent planning at this stage. Next slide. We also took a look at ISS, and I've actually just summarized it here because we're going to discuss it later. These are the elements that we took into what we called a more realistic budget profile. Shuttle flyout through March 2011, Constellation IOC in mid-2017, it's 2-year delay, and we assumed that ISS extends to 2020. And we'll discuss that, as I said, in some detail later. But if you want to think of it that deorbiting it in 2016 would give it only about 5 years worth of operational lifetime. And by the way, if you deorbit it in 2016, if Constellation IOC is 2017, there's nothing for Orion to fly to. So it just made sense to have at least a story that hung together in this discussion. So we actually asked NASA's independent PA&E group to do an estimate of the program based on these assumptions. Next one. So here we are going to build up the elements again for you. This is the shuttle program that you've seen. Now we've got retirement scheduled for mid-FY11. Next one. Here are the additional shuttle costs that come on as a result of that extension. Next. Here is Constellation. Next one. And these are the additional costs that accrue to Constellation as a result of the slip in IOC. Some of that, by the way, is additional Soyuz flights that you would have to purchase. They were just book kept under the Constellation budget. We won't argue about that now, but there were costs that needed to be captured in this. So there are additional Soyuzes that you need to buy because the Constellation Orion has slipped. Next one. That shows you the gap. The gap is now longer. We've now got over a 6-year gap. By the way, the longest since we've started flying people into space in the United States. Next one. There's ISS, and next. If you continue ISS, there's the addition to the budget. Next. There's our black line. Next. Go ahead. One more. Here is the integral under that is the current budget that we're planning to. Next. There's the addition on top. Next. If you want to look at what these numbers are, I can just tell you that the integral under that cross-hatched curve is $15.3 billion. And the components that make it up are shuttles about 1.3 billion, Constellation's about 4.7, and ISS is about 9.3 billion. And that is ISS not fully utilized, so it's not any sort of an enhanced ISS at all. An enhanced ISS would be it would be a total of about 14 billion, I believe. So we think that that previous chart a few back that shows this more realistic unfolding of the budget with the budget line that we're constrained to, we think that's why we're here. That's the reason that this review is taking place. Next slide. To motivate some of our scenarios, I wanted to have one quick slide on the gap. This is what it looks like, again, in this perhaps more realistic scenario. As Bo's group will discuss in more detail, we don't believe that other options besides Constellation reduce this gap from the right by very much. You might be able to get a year, maybe a year and a half, maybe not, and we'll leave that to Bo's discussion time tomorrow. But this gap produces a gap in our ability to launch people into space from this country, as a couple people have alluded to several times in our public hearings. It creates a reliance on Soyuz for crew transportation. It's also a significant impact to the workforce. Perhaps more important, there's a potential loss of skills that we've spent literally decades building up in this country of how to launch and operate spacecraft. And we're going to have at least 6 years where we just get out of practice on that and do not have a way of training the next group, the next generation that's actually going to be operating the vehicle that succeeds the shuttle. The gap is also a significant reduction in our ability to carry things up to, and really a significant impact to our ability to carry things down from ISS. The station is going to be reliant on new and we think actually very, very exciting and promising, but still unproven launch systems. And these are the H-2B, along with the HTV from Japan, Falcon 9 and Dragon, and Taurus 2 and Cygnus. And that even with those working perfectly, it still limits the shuttle, the station utilization. Next slide. Now, let me go through just a couple of the shuttle scenarios that we looked at. We've actually selected 3 shuttle flyout or extension scenarios that we'd like the full committee to consider, and we actually think that these do a pretty good job of spanning the reasonable trade space, and they're scenarios that you can kind of put a story together that makes some sense. The first one is to fly out the existing manifest through March 2011. The second is to add 1 additional shuttle flight in 2012, and smart people in the room will say, why only 1? And we'll get to that. And the third is to extend the shuttle at 2 flights a year or fewer, 1 to 2 flights a year through 2014 to partially actually significantly close the gap. And we note right here, and we're going to really emphasize this later on, it only makes sense to analyze this option in conjunction with some sort of a shuttle-derived heavy lift vehicle. So this is where the committee would have to come together and decide whether this entire option makes sense to consider as an integrated set. Next one. All right, scenario number 1, I've already talked about this some. The rationale behind it is there is not much margin left in the shuttle schedule. Our experience suggests that it's going to take a little bit longer than is currently allowed for in the manifest to safely fly it out. We think this is just a more realistic scenario, and it would avoid undue pressure to complete flights within a particular budget year. And having said that, it's been our impression that NASA is currently doing a magnificent job, actually, of taking the flights one at a time and considering safety first as whether to launch on a particular day or to delay the flight a day, a week, a month. But the closer you get to a hard and fast deadline, the more difficult that becomes. We've got plenty of experience to illustrate that in the past. And so we just think that it would be very prudent to just go ahead right now and plan for flying out in 2011, budgetary planning for it. So advantages, prudent flyout schedule, realistic budget planning. Disadvantages, it adds some money. but on the other hand, it's likely to cost that much money anyway, so you might as well plan for it. Next. Cost of this, as estimated by the Shuttle program, is about $1.5 billion. We'd actually like to get the independent assessment group to take a look at that. We think that may include some of those carrying costs that might have been picked up by Constellation in FY11. We're not sure. Most of those costs do come in FY11, so there may be a little bit of double counting in this number. We're not positive. We do note that there is not an operational impact to the Constellation program. It would take some money away from it potentially, but it doesn't affect the turnover of facilities, and it doesn't affect the other resources. It doesn't, however, help very much in the workforce transition. Next. Second scenario, add one shuttle flight in 2012. So I've got it as a note on the next slide, but I might as well say it up front. We weren't smart enough to ask about only one shuttle flight at first. We asked about adding 2 or 3 additional shuttle flights, and we were told quickly that there is one and only one extra external tank. And if you want to add more than one shuttle flight, you have to restart ET production. With some cost, which means rehiring a few people and restarting a production line. So the costs go up quite a bit if you go for, the cost per flight actually go up quite a bit if you add more than one flight. So we said, okay, we understand, talk to us about adding one flight. So that's the reason for one as opposed to 2 or 3. The rationale behind this, does this make sense at all? Well, now we're thinking about ISS. ISS is totally dependent on 4 new vehicles/capsules for all of the logistical maintenance and utilization support. 3 of them haven't flown yet. They've got a lot of promise, but they haven't flown. 1 has only flown once, that's the ATV. There's a risk of delays in any one of them, and those could adversely affect station utilization. They wouldn't, the station itself can survive going down to just operations and maintenance, really reducing utilization, reducing crew if necessary. They can handle a delay of a year or 2 years in these capabilities coming online. But then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the purpose of the station in the first place? It's to actually use it. And so we're putting ISS in a very fragile situation the moment we retire Shuttle. As I think it was Steve said, a station was conceived and designed and built, and its operational philosophy was built around the thought that it would have the shuttle. And that means a certain amount of up mass and a certain amount of down mass. You can carry a certain amount of stuff up, you can bring a certain amount of stuff down, and it affected the way that they think about everything, including things like spare parts. You don't buy a new spare part every time you need one. You bring the one down that isn't working, you refurbish it, and you send it back up. So there are a lot of things that need to change in this, in the thinking. And we think that it's possible that even one extra shuttle flight could send up a kind of a slug of utilization, either experiments or infrastructure, could take into account any unforeseen delays in the providers, or into account any unforeseen requirements for up mass or, by the way, down mass. So it's almost one protection flight in your manifest. So the advantages mitigate ISS reliance on an unproven resupply capability just in the very short term, enable some additional utilization support, which our international partners will tell us is important, retain our human launch capability a little bit longer but not much. Disadvantage, it's an additional cost, especially just for one flight. Next slide. But here is a graphic to drive it home to you. Up mass and down mass capabilities of the shuttle compared to all the vehicles that are available to replace it. And we had seen this chart before, but it hadn't been to scale, and I told them I wanted it to point home. Shuttle is a very, very capable vehicle. It can get a lot of stuff up to station. and it can bring a lot of stuff back. And as soon as you retire it, you are really constraining what you can do on station. You're making it very, very reliant on all the other providers. And all you need to do is take your little ruler and kind of add up number of flights that are required to equal one shuttle flight to ISS. Next slide. The cost of this, it's $4.2 billion over the current baseline. It's $2.7 billion over scenario 1, which we think is the more reasonable one. So if you subtract out the 1.5 that I showed you on scenario 1 from the 4.2, that's how you get the additional 2.7. Again, there's possibility for double counting in this number. We're going to try to get refinement on it, but it's a pretty good first stab at it. I mentioned 1 ET. We'd phase the flights appropriately to support ISS. It really doesn't provide much relief for the workforce transition problem, because you do still have a potential loss as a result of the gap of a significant part of your skilled operations workforce. Next slide. Scenario number 3. This is extend the shuttle at 1 to 2 flights a year through 2014 to significantly close the gap. And again, although we didn't start this way, we realized very quickly that the rest of the panel would disown us if we tried to promote this scenario in conjunction with anything other than a shuttle-derived heavy lift vehicle. So you're actually not going to see budget numbers associated with this, and I'll get to that reason in a second. The rationale for this one is that it's the most realistic way to significantly reduce the gap. And it's also the most realistic way to robustly use the ISS's full capacity. And again, we can talk about this at some length a little bit later in the afternoon. When you couple this with a shuttle-derived vehicle, the synergy could mitigate the cost of the shuttle extension, because there's an enormous sharing of vehicles, of infrastructure, and of production infrastructure, ops infrastructure capabilities if you go this way. So the advantages: reduces the gap in launch capability, supports robust U.S. and international utilization of ISS, and we'll get to some closer definition of robust later on in the afternoon. It does provide a smooth workforce transition. You don't lose those ops people or the production folks. And it does take maximum advantage of the existing infrastructure. It minimizes the number of changes that you need to make to the infrastructure. Disadvantages: cost. Mitigated a reasonable amount when coupled with a shuttle-derived HLV, but we don't pretend to comment on that relative to other architectures that Ed's group is going to present. It does extend the life of the shuttle, and we would suggest that an independent assessment of the risk of that would be an important thing. We do recognize, and I actually agree with the point of view that when the CABE said the shuttle should either be retired in 2010 or recertified by 2010 in order to extend its life, that NASA has, as part of the Return to Flight program and on, been piece by piece recertifying that, and that largely meets the intent of the CABE. But I think we should have an independent assessment of that fact before we go anywhere down that road. Next slide. Cost. Very difficult to compare directly with scenarios 1 and 2 at this stage, and it's because of the different carrying cost profiles. As I said, we got a costing of the combined shuttle and shuttle-derived infrastructure, but when I tried to pull out the pieces and see what numbers would be useful to give to this panel for direct comparison, it was impossible to do. And it was impossible because there were still pieces of Constellation that were in the budget that we got, and we didn't know which were being carried and which weren't. There was a future infrastructure architecture that was partially assumed in the budget we got, and it just didn't make sense for us to be doing the analysis of that. So we've got a place for an integrated scenario to start from, should the committee decide to go that way. But we want to kick the can down the road to the Beyond LEO group with this one. So some notes. The preliminary estimate for the shuttle-derived IOC was 2016. Take that just for what it is. We'd defer to Bo's group to assess that number. We just took it. The shuttle and the shuttle-derived, the program did not believe that they would compete for facilities or for resources on the schedule that they developed. And there is some savings costs in a few different places, and I know just one of them. One is in the Soyuz costs for ISS. Next slide. Okay, I think next thing that we're going to do is make the transition into a discussion of station and station scenarios, and I'd invite questions right now, but I suspect that we're going to be better off if we lay out everything on the table, because this really is kind of an integrated story, as you can see from the shuttle scenario discussions. So I think we'd do well to get through the ISS discussions first. And Les is going to kick that off with some observations from the national community.